You're listening to Cottontail's podcast, part of the Silicon Valley Black Project, which produced the documentary film A Place at the Table about the Black pioneers of Silicon Valley. A Place at the Table can be viewed for rent on Vimeo.com on demand /A Place at the Table STEM. Through Cottontail's podcast, the Silicon Valley Black Project will continue to recognize the contributions made by African Americans. We will be featuring African American professionals, technologists in the fields of engineering, administration, and entrepreneurial pursuits from the past and present. Today, we are talking to Maynard Holliday. Mr. Holliday is a senior engineer working in robotics and artificial intelligence. He is currently working in the Global Talent Research Group within the Engineering and Applied Sciences organization at the RAND Corporation. Maynard, your roots are from the East Coast. Talk about the path you took to come to Silicon Valley.
Yeah, so, my parents are natives of North Carolina. Both parents went to historically Black colleges. So my mother went to North Carolina Central University. My father went to Shaw University, and both in Raleigh, North Carolina. First generation, of course, to go to college. And so they met there. They dated and married in my mother's hometown of Jamesville, North Carolina. And so both went on to graduate school. So my dad to the Andover Newton Theological Seminary in Boston, and then my mother to Simmons. He got a call from a Baptist church in Providence, Rhode Island. Left Boston and moved to Providence, but still, was active in the civil rights movement. And was a founding member of either the Rhode Island or the Providence, I don't know if it was the state or the city, chapter of SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference chapter there. Wherever Dr. King was marching, that's where he was on the weekend. He got a position with the New York City Council of Churches. So we moved to New York in the mid-'60s to the Bronx. And went to public schools in the Bronx. And then my mother got a librarian position with the New York City Public Schools in the Bronx. And that's where she spent her entire career. And my dad spent his entire career with the Council of Churches and became the executive director for the New York City Council of Churches. Being so focused on education, they recognized that the New York City public schools were deficient. They looked for good public school systems in the suburbs, ended up in Scarsdale, New York. So it's like Palo Alto here. So it's, well-funded, top-line public education. In the fifth grade, in the middle of fifth grade, we moved to Scarsdale. That changed the trajectory of our educational background.
So what are your earliest memories about how you were feeling about your family, though?
That it was accomplished. So I had uncles who were role models for me. For example, my mother's uncle, grandmother's brother, was the first African American to get a PhD from the University of Chicago in the sciences. His name was Ulysses Brooks. He got I think a PhD in chemistry. Was revered in the family to the point where my mother's youngest brother was named after him. And he was also Ulysses. She had two other brothers who were math professors at the local community college, I guess the Black colleges. So they taught calculus, which, some deep, heavy stuff.
Absolutely.
And so this great Uncle Ulysses became a professor at Johnson C. Smith, an HBCU. The younger Uncle Ulysses, my mother's brother, became an engineer for RCA and worked on the space program. They were helping NASA, land on the moon. So these, were my family who, were technically oriented. These uncles that I had, were every bit as capable and could have become engineers, contributed, but because of the systemic, racism of the day, they were slotted into teaching positions at community colleges. And so this younger Uncle Ulysses got to be an engineer for RCA. And, he was kind of like my favorite uncle because he was the youngest and closest in age and would visit us, before he got married and had kids, made a big impression. So he used to sell computer time, where you would hook your phone up. And so I remember him coming to our little apartment in the Bronx and selling, computer time to different companies.
Was that run by Texas Instrument? Wasn't I used to take one of those home from work and do and work on the computer.
Yeah, yeah. So you remember that. So that was, kind of my family circumstance.
Moved to Scarsdale, New York. What schools were you going to then? How, did you go from there to college or?
So I went through junior high. So let's talk about the popular culture of the day. So Star Trek, comic books, and the U.S. space program. And so when I talk to students to this day, I talk about my motivations, and my role models back then were fictional. I didn't see a reflection. In Star Trek, it was multiracial. The architect of Starfleet computer system was a black man. If you remember, I think it's Richard Marshall played, Dr. Richard Daystrom. He was the architect of all of, the computer systems. And so that made a, huge impression on me. And then in the comic books, T'Challa, the Black Panther, is an engineer. And, he's Wakanda's king, as well as, one of its top, technical brains. And, in the movies, that character, went to Shuri. But in the comics, it was T'Challa. So another role model. And then, fast forward to the NASA shuttle program, finally in that first class, picked some African Americans. And so those were the motivations. So, Star Trek, comic books, Iron Man was another in the sense that he didn't have a superpower. His brain was a superpower, right? And so he designed and built, his armor. And so he was another role model, again, fictional. That lit the fire under me in junior high. You had to accelerate yourself so that you would be recommended for algebra in ninth grade so that you could take calculus by senior year. And so that's when the switch went off in my mind. If I wanted to be engineering school ready, I had to be recommended to take algebra in ninth grade, and I needed that recommendation in eighth grade. So the switch went off. I became serious, more serious. I was always serious, but more serious. And I had to make that impression upon, the white teachers that, were teaching me. And, to their credit, they recognized, my work ethic and recommended me for, algebra. So when I got to high school, ninth grade, I was in algebra.
Now, were there other black children, black students as well in your classes, or were you with?
Yeah, so there was a handful, less than half a dozen, but none interested, in the math and sciences like I was. The diversity was at home. And so I'm sure you've heard of Jack and Jill.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we were in Jack and Jill. And then my dad, being the director of the Council of Churches, he knew all the, Black churches, in New York City. So you've heard of Abyssinian, where Adam Clayton Powell was the minister. So, he knew him. And so we would split our time between going to the predominantly white Baptist church in Scarsdale and going to Harlem to Black church.
Church. So, go to church.
Yep. So so we did that, and during the summers, parents enrolled us in the Harlem School of the Arts, and we were, as I said, in Jack and Jill. So we got all those inputs to know our identity.
You could go from one group to another and still be comfortable. Yeah. But in your family, though, you were surrounded by not only by diversity, but you had people who were doing the things that you wanted to do. Right. So you got to see it. Yeah. So you're one of those kids who came to class and had the language already.
Yep. And could, as they say, code switch. Because I was also a good athlete. So I was a varsity basketball player, a track athlete. Ran on the varsity track team. But so here's another seminal event. I get to junior year in high school, and playing basketball, and I chose, rather than to go to basketball camp, was told about a summer program, actually Black high school juniors that were interested in engineering in Chicago. So the story there was I was taking physics, and I needed a tutor. And to my parents' credit, they went up to the school. They didn't know physics, and these two white PhD physicists who used to work at Argonne National Lab in Illinois. I don't know who they worked for in New York, but they put up a, if you remember, these bulletin boards, and they would have little strips with phone numbers on them.
Yes.
And so, my mother went to the school and found, their little ad on a bulletin board for physics tutoring once or twice a week. And so they were like, if you're really serious about this, I know a program at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago that is called the Early ID Program for Minorities in Engineering. And I'll introduce the directors of that program to your parents. And so sure enough, the directors, was mostly for Chicago kids, but they wanted out of town kids as well. And they came to New York. My dad talked to them. They told them about the program. And so the summer between my junior year and senior year, I spent in Chicago at the Illinois Institute of Technology, taking classes, and doing engineering projects, all with other Black students from New Jersey, from Atlanta, from New Orleans. And we stayed in a white fraternity, and lived on campus. And I spent 8 weeks in Chicago. And then what the professors there were able to share with us is what the top engineering schools were. And so they recommended Carnegie Mellon. I had never heard of it. I was like, Carnegie who? Carnegie Watermelon? What? And so they recommended some other programs. And so when I got back to my senior year in high school, I had a list of schools that had good engineering programs recommended by these faculty members that I had met the summer before. And so that list consisted of Boston University, Purdue, MIT, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, because I had advanced myself in algebra, I was taking the AP class so that I could be engineering program ready. So that's how I got to that point.
So, what was your experience like at Carnegie Mellon?
Talking about code switching here. So, based on my background coming from Scarsdale, I had more in common with the white students, right? Because I was coming from a majority, white environment. But I get to Carnegie Mellon, and so I met, the black students because I could play basketball, and so I went to the gym and was hooping with everybody, and that's how I met people because I could play, ball, and it turns out they had a summer program for Black students to get them ready for the rigors of Carnegie Mellon. I placed out of it because of my test scores and the fact that I had taken calculus. I did not have to come. In retrospect, it might have been better if I had come because I would have known everybody. But within a few weeks, because I was living in the dorms, playing ball, and everybody was self-segregating. I got to meet people. Carnegie Mellon was segregated in the sense that there was a white Greek system, and when they rushed, for people to come to their fraternities, uh, we were excluded. So I had a white roommate from Pennsylvania, and I, distinctly remember, the frat boys coming to our dorm, come to our, rush party, giving the invitation to my roommate, not to me, saying, you're not welcome here. Um, and so Carnegie Mellon had a program uh, at the time was called CMAP, Carnegie Mellon Action Project, that was a resource for African American students on campus. So they provided tutoring, they provided course files, they provided resume writing, and then connectivity to summer internships. And so that was our kind of home, and that was a center of Black life, in addition to something called the Spirit House, where blacks, it was a Black themed house that was on campus as well. I wanted more, and I explored, the Black fraternity um, situation. First semester sophomore year, um, I was interested in Alpha because my dad is an Alpha. Several of my classmates and I went down to the University of Pittsburgh, which is just about a 10-15 minute walk from the Carnegie Mellon campus. And, we went to, what's called the Smoker to, hear what the brothers were, talking about. And, my big draw was, my father, who is a role model, and the fact that, Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King, Andrew Young, were all alphas. And so these are all Black men that I, looked up to and admired. So I got online the first semester of sophomore year, pledged, crossed, the burning sands, right before Thanksgiving. The academic load between Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh was, orders of magnitude different. So I began with 15 other African Americans in mechanical engineering, and only two or three of us graduated.
Really?
Yeah. And so years later, the president, a new president of the university, apologized for,
Apologize.
apologized to the students from that era because, when they reached out, to solicit donations, people were like, not after what I went through. So they did some homework as to, what the environment was like back then, and recognized that they had a problem. You could take 2 and 3 finals like in the same day. CMU back then, it was nothing, back to back to back finals and just crushing, problem sets.
Yes. So when you graduated, though, did you graduate and go to Stanford, or did you graduate and go to into another?
I was inundated with job trips, and this was during the Reagan defense buildup in the mid 80s. I had half a dozen job offers. I chose the job offer that I got from the Lawrence Livermore Lab here in the Bay Area, because they flew me out after one of our, a really wet winter. And, as you know, things are gorgeous. The hills are green, the air is clear, and flowers are blooming. And I was coming from Pittsburgh, where everything was dead. Lawrence Livermore, to their credit, said, what's your highest offer? And it was a GM offer from a auto body plant in Pittsburgh. That was my highest offer. So I put it in front of, the recruiter at Livermore, and they beat it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Just took the money off the table, and I could just evaluate it based on job content. And so I never forget, the dean of the engineering school, said to me, he's like, look, you got this really rigorous, education, Livermore is a place that you could use it. And his guide was, are they solving differential equations there? So I'll get to Livermore in June of '84 in the nuclear test division. So we're testing nuclear weapons in the desert. So, I spent weeks at the Nevada test site, and then doing calculations. And I said to myself, I went to, one of the top engineering schools in the country, and I'm playing with dirt. And so what I noted, Kathy, was that the people around me who were doing more interesting work had graduate degrees. Looked around and found out that the laboratory had a graduate program with both UC Berkeley and Stanford, and you could take classes and get your master's at these schools. And what I found out is you could audit classes through this honors cooperative program at Stanford. So you didn't have to be admitted, but you could audit them and take them for a grade. And so I went through this process called transcript reconstruction, where I would prove that I could do the work. And so I started auditing, Stanford classes in mechanical engineering in their graduate division. And I was acing them, working full time, and then trying to do, Stanford caliber work. I wasn't doing either justice. So I wasn't doing well at work, and I wasn't doing as well as I could in these Stanford classes. Have you heard of the GEM program? It's the Graduate Consortium for Minorities in Engineering.
Does it still exist?
It does. So you can look it up. GEM. They are a consortia of universities and companies formed as a bridge to pay for minority students to get their master's degrees, and then hoping that the schools would then pick them up for PhD programs. And so they only paid for master's degrees, and the way it worked is you applied both to the school and to this GEM program. And so the GEM program, would have a company pick you, and they and the GEM program would pay for your master's. I applied to the master's program and was admitted. So, I started my transcript reconstruction, almost immediately after spending, so much time at the Nevada test site. Yeah, so I matriculated full time in the fall of '87 to the design division of the mechanical engineering department. And that's where I focused on robotics. And so I took all of the robotics classes that Stanford offered while, when I was there. And then I also chose a robotics themed capstone master's project that was sponsored by Lockheed. And it was what they call a gravity gradient satellite positioner, and actually won an award for our project from a arc welding institute that awarded degrees, or not degrees, awards on innovative master's projects. And then during that year, I proposed to my now wife, and today is our 32nd anniversary.
Congratulations. Is that the special meal you're having delivered this evening? Your anniversary meal?
That's right. And so we got married at Mem Chu the following February. So I graduated in June of '88, and we got married at Mem Chu February of '89.
Wow. Mem Chu. Yeah. What is Mem Chu?
Memorial Church.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So any Stanford person will know. So when you hear, they'll know what Mem Chu is. My experience at Stanford. So I wanted to continue and do my PhD. And when I canvassed the faculty, nobody would accept me on their team because I didn't have the money and I was Black. So, so just to be very clear, that was my experience. When I canvassed, the aerospace faculty, when I canvassed the ME faculty who I knew, there was no interest in accepting me, into their groups. So I graduated and moved on. And so the other piece of data you should know is that the GEM program, for that very reason, maybe at other schools as well, expanded their support to now include PhD programs.
I see. So you would, at least you'd have the money.
So they couldn't say, hey, you didn't have, you don't have money. So once I was admitted to Stanford, I had to get partnered, with an advisor. And my advisor, turns out, also went to Carnegie Mellon. And so what he told me when we first met, I always remember, he said, oh, you went to Carnegie Mellon, you're not going to have a problem here. And he was absolutely right. And it wasn't because Stanford was easy. It was because Carnegie Mellon was so rigorous. I didn't have a problem at Stanford. So I did just fine. And, grades were, stellar. And so I went through the interview process again after I graduated, and ended up back at Lawrence Livermore, but in the laser fusion program, designing automated systems for Livermore's large lasers. And so that was, very interesting to me. And then, like I said, got married in February of '89.
So now, when you went back to Livermore, how did you end up on the president's commission? What is this now?
Oh, so that was years later. The people who are Yeah, who work at these weapons labs. So, Lawrence Livermore, Los Alamos, Sandia are the nuclear weapons labs. And so I call that the
So
priesthood.
that's the priesthood. The people okay. Who are.
So I've worked at two of three of those labs. Peace broke out in 1991 when the Berlin Wall fell. Senators Nunn and Lugar back then got legislation passed through Congress called cooperative threat reduction, and the premise was, which was a brilliant one, was we've spent billions, maybe trillions to win the Cold War. Let's spend a few more billion to win the peace. At the time, the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, was bankrupt. Their currency wasn't worth anything on the on the Western market. These weapons scientists, who at the top of the social order, were no longer getting paid, and so just to support themselves, weapons grade material was now for sale, represented a what we call a proliferation threat, and they asked the nuclear priesthood, as well as the weapons complex laboratories, to these newly independent states and propose cooperative work of mutual interest that then the U.S. government would wholly pay for, to keep what I found to be brilliant engineers and scientists gainfully employed. The Ukrainians pivoted to the West instead of remaining in Russia's orbit, accepted U.S. foreign aid, and they became, for a short period of time, the number 3 recipient of U.S. foreign aid, behind Israel and Egypt. And so I went to Ukraine, a place called the Institute for Special Mechanical Problems. And so what that institute was, it turned out to be the institute that built the guidance and control systems for ballistic missiles. Well before I got there, Ukraine returned all of their ballistic missiles to Russia. So they became a non-nuclear state in exchange for Western aid. And so I was part of that Western aid. So I get to Kiev with one of my colleagues from Livermore, and we meet with these engineers from the Institute of Special Mechanical Problems, and we ask them what they'd like to work on together. They say, we're having issues, obvious issues at Chernobyl, which to this day is still, the world's worst nuclear accident. And so, I put on my robotics hat. The nuclear core was still on fire. And so when I got there in 94, so the accident was in 86, I believe, they had built this sarcophagus, but it was disintegrating, and they still didn't know if the nuclear fuel was still burning. And so they needed to characterize under the core what was going on. And the only way you could do that was to send in robots, because it was lethal to any human that would be in there for any few minutes. You'd get a lethal dose of radiation. So that kicked off, one of the signature projects of my career, which was leading this effort to design a telerobotic radiation-hardened mobile vehicle for Chernobyl characterization.
Is that was the prototype for the Mars Pathfinders?
Oh yeah, yes. So here's the story: is NASA in its wisdom is always looking for a terrestrial analog for a hostile interplanetary environment. Chernobyl, world's worst nuclear accident, is a is a candidate. So they don't have to go into space to do this testing. And just today, that rover Perseverance just landed, and you find out that they did their testing in Western Australia. because the rock formations were similar. With the Pathfinder, they wanted to verify the design of their vision system, and then also a smart coring system. And so I came back, after that first trip to Ukraine, and I put together the team that ultimately designed, built, and fabricated the robot. Um, and and so that was NASA's angle. They wanted, like I said, a terrestrial analog for a hostile interplanetary environment.
So you came back and worked for NASA?
No, 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 no. I still work for Lawrence Livermore, but I put together the team. And so I came back from that, and a colleague of mine who is now the president of the University of Maryland, first African American president. So I want to give Dr. Darrell Pines a shout out. He was a colleague of mine at Lawrence Livermore. He came to my office one day with some brochures about the AAAS Science Technology Policy Fellows Program, which is a program that you apply for, and they take scientists and engineers and put them in the executive branch to advise the government. And so I said to myself, how can I get, this Chernobyl robot funded? So I need to understand, the levers of a policy. And so I applied for this AAAS fellowship and was awarded it, and negotiated a leave of absence from Lawrence Livermore in 1995, right after I, came back from Ukraine. I was awarded a what they call a Science and Diplomacy Fellow, and I was placed in the U.S. Agency for International Development. So in parallel, to me, working on development issues, I was trying to suss out who would fund this robot project, and I was able to find out who the lead was for international nuclear reactor safety at the State Department. And I was able to get a meeting with her, tell her my idea, because the international community was like, how do we stabilize Chernobyl? And I said, well, the only way you're going to characterize it without, putting people in harm's way is with robots. And so they were like, you're right. So she recognized, my background and expertise, and said, Maynard, I'm going to call a meeting, but you're going to run it. And so she called an interagency meeting where she got the Department of Energy, NASA, and her State Department colleagues all in one room. And by that time, I had recruited one of my former professors' companies called Red Zone Robotics. And so they built the robots that eventually went into 3 Mile Island to characterize, how bad the damage was. And so I said to myself, these guys are the industry leaders, and I've already characterized 3 Mile Island. I want them to, work on Chernobyl. And so they were in on that first meeting as well. So they were going to be my system integrators and build the robot, because they already had experience. Yeah. So in parallel with my fellowship, I was doing that.
Did you ever file a patent for any of your work?
No. In the well, not for that work. So I filed patent. I was on a patent later. So we, so put the team together, and one of the things, and again, people who know the history of Silicon Valley, there was a company here called Silicon Graphics, and so that's where Jim Clark was, and Ken Coleman. Yeah, that's where he was. And that's where my Stanford roommate was, at Silicon Graphics. And so Silicon Graphics said, we'd like to participate with you, Maynard, on your Chernobyl characterization project and provide you the graphical horsepower to process the images from the JPL 3D camera. And so they gave us all, in-kind support. They just provided, the computational, hardware that could process the video images that the robot was able to get. Like I said, Red Zone, the Carnegie Mellon Robotics Institute, myself at Lawrence Livermore, Westinghouse. They provided us the hot cell where we could irradiate the robot to see how it performed in a high radiation environment. And then, racism reared its head.
No kidding.
So there was a DOE program manager who wanted his laboratory that he favored, get credit for the work. And so we had built the robot; it was ready to go. And, I got removed from the project because I had just offended him somehow in some meeting where I said we needed more support, or that I was too uppity for him.
You probably just walked through the door the wrong way. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah. For whatever reason. So, he got me removed from the project, and the robot got delivered in the fall of '99. And then I was having my own issues after I returned to Livermore after my fellowship. I had this Washington experience, these contacts, our sponsor, the Department of Energy. And, by that time I had spent 15 years there and not promoted once.
This is at Livermore, Lawrence Livermore?
Yeah, at Livermore. So I'd gotten this fellowship. And then, the other piece of news or information, I'd interviewed to be an astronaut twice. The 94, 95 cycle, and then the 96, 98, because they did it every other year. Yep. So I interviewed to be an astronaut twice. I got this AAAS fellowship. I, led this Chernobyl project, but I couldn't get a promotion at Lawrence Livermore. And so I was like, I'm out. And so, once they took the robotics project away from me, I started looking for a job in Silicon Valley. And, within a week of putting my resume, on whatever service there was back then, got a bunch of interest, and ended up, landing at Schlumberger Semiconductor Solutions. And so I left Livermore in '99 to go to Silicon Valley. And who would have thunk, that racism reared its head, throughout my tenure in a whole bunch of companies, there.
It's real.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you are outnumbered 90-1 when you walk in any situation. And secondly, they don't believe you're real, and they don't believe you know what you know. So they spend a lot of time trying to prove that. And then once they can't prove it, then they find another reason why you shouldn't be on the program. Well, we've probably gone through iterations of this same story over and over again.
Right.
So was there any place that you worked where you felt you were very successful and supported?
Well, so let's fast forward to the Obama administration. That was the honor and privilege of my career, and the backstory there is I had a high school classmate from Scarsdale who was Obama's secretary for weapons of mass destruction. So he had a very interesting and consequential background and contribution identifying chemical weapons uh, caches in the former Soviet Union. His name is Andy Weber, and he's since retired, but he was a foreign service officer. You can read about his exploits in a book called The Dead Hand. Long story short is, after I had my odyssey in Silicon Valley, I could get into these companies, but couldn't advance, or was asked to leave after change of management, or whatever. I went back to the nuclear priesthood to Sandia National Lab, and it turned out that the department I was working in reported to my high school classmate Andy.
Wow.
Yeah, they said, yeah, we work for this guy at the Defense Department named Andy Weber, and I was like, yeah, I went to high school with a dude named Andy Weber. So let me look, and sure enough, there he was, looking like me now, with with no hair, but it was him. And so he came out to California to talk about his program, and he did a tour where he went to Stanford and he went to Berkeley to talk to their kind of national security programs. And so I went to Stanford to see him talk, and we reconnected, and he told me, come see him next time I was in Washington. And Kathy, it took us 3 years to get together because of our schedules. In 2014, in the spring of 2014, we have lunch at the Pentagon, and I thought we were just going to be talking about high school, our mutual, friends and classmates. But he said, how would you like to join the Obama administration?
That's a no-brainer right there.
And I said, excuse me? And we, and he was serious. And he's like, send me your resume and I'll send it to the White House with my recommendation. Because, he knew what my career trajectory was, having been in the nuclear priesthood, having been in Silicon Valley, having been a AAAS fellow, now, back at, a national laboratory. So I had a unique background, plus the pedigree of anybody else they would be looking at. I did that, came home, updated the resume, sent it to him. He sent it to the White House, and the White House called me that summer and said, we're interested in you joining us. Can you send us all your social media handles? Because we don't want, we're going to do a social media vet to make sure haven't said anything that will embarrass,
The cancel culture, they call it, when they find you say one little thing.
Yeah, I mean, that didn't happen in the last administration, but the Obama team, was on it. So I already had, my security clearance back. So I get a call in August saying, welcome aboard. When can you be in Washington? And I was like, huh? By that time, my youngest daughter had been admitted to university, and so she was the last one at home, and so she uh, needed to look at colleges. That's when I took the opportunity to take her on our college tour, and then go to the Pentagon to interview with who would become my boss. And so that happened in the summer of 2014. So we visited Princeton, and she ended up going there. Got to DC, and I went to the Pentagon to talk to who became my boss, and he said, you have this unique background. I'm gonna pick you as my special assistant. From a technical standpoint, from a geek standpoint, this was a dream position because DARPA reported to him, the Office of Naval Research, all of the laboratories the Department of Defense had, and all what we call the FFRDCs, federally funded research and development centers that the Department of Defense has. also came through his office. So I was, the senior technical advisor, special assistant, and uh, and he had me sitting in his office suite. And so every meeting that he was, most every meeting he was in, I was in. Um, and he valued my input on a variety of programs. A lot of them classified. So Ash Carter, the Secretary of Defense at the time, gave a speech about rewiring the Pentagon, and he rightly recognized that the script had flipped from post World War II, where the Defense Department was the number one customer in Silicon Valley, to where now, because of globalization, it's you know a global market, and innovations in cybersecurity, robotics, artificial intelligence, drones, microsatellites, synthetic biology are all moving faster in the commercial sector than in the defense sector. And so he made the salient right point that in order for us to maintain our technological superiority, we need to impedance match the rate of innovation of the commercial sector with Pentagon problem sets. He came to my boss, who was the head of acquisition, and said, Frank, make this happen. And my boss came to me because I was from Silicon Valley and had already demonstrated some connectivity with my colleagues to help stand this up. So I spent most of the summer of 2015 um, back home, first and foremost, figuring out where it was going to go, who was going to staff it, and then what the attractants were going to be for the community, Silicon Valley community, to want to come work for the Defense Department. We found a California National Guard Army Reserve Center right outside the fence of Moffett Field. We negotiated, we already owned the building. And so the Secretary of Defense was able to say, we're going to take over this corner of the building and turn it into the Defense Innovation Unit. And after, him announcing it in April, me getting the charge to do something, in June. And so we opened it in September. One of the things I'm most proud of is it survived, contact with the Trump administration. During the Trump years, it dropped the experimental. And so they dropped the X because they recognized the value. And so it's now just the Defense Innovation Unit. So I got the Defense Medal for Exceptional Public Service at the end of my tenure. The Pentagon and the Defense Department was the most diverse and meritocratic place I ever worked, and especially in the uniformed services, because the military is the most integrated organization still to this day in the country. There are general officers and leaders of color in the building. I was the first, Black person in my role, and so I, surprised, lots of people when I was introduced, because they were like, "Oh, we've never seen, somebody look like you in this position." I would always, wear my badge with a Stanford lanyard, so I didn't have to say anything. Sometimes I did, because they were like, "Well, what's your affiliation with Stanford?"
Right. And, what team did you play on in
Right,
Stanford?
right. So yeah, so those are other stories. For the most part, I got the respect, and my boss, gave me challenging assignments. I was able to execute for him, and fast forward to campaign 2020, he actually recruited me to the Biden campaign, and I worked on the Biden campaign all last year.
What did you do for them?
I was on their defense policy group. Anytime there was an issue, we would write these white papers, and they would get vetted amongst the team so he could take them home on the weekend to digest. And then we were on call for the debates. He could be briefed on a particular issue, and we were doing that in real time on Signal. It was great to be part of that team and to see him win in the fall.
You joined RAND in 2017, so you left.
Yeah, so right after the Obama administration, I was recruited by RAND to help open their San Francisco office, because I said I can't take another remote job and have my marriage survive. And so RAND said, well, you know what, you're in luck, because we want to open a San Francisco one. And so RAND has 4 what they call FFRDCs, federally funded research and development centers. So we're the Air Force's think tank, the Army's think tank, the Office of Secretary of Defense's think tank, and then in the past 3 years, Department of Homeland Security think tank. So we provide, kind of policy guidance, and as some Randites like to say, we're the consumer reports for the government. And so I do technology horizon scanning for those FFRDCs. I'm working on an AI bias project right now, robotic technologies as it applies to Air Force logistics. So a lot of interesting work that takes advantage of my connectivity to Silicon Valley.
Well, the other part is the thing that as I'm listening to you, you're that guy that is at the table.
Right.
That should be there at the table. Whereas if we're at the table, we can have some input and maybe even change some people's mind about it.
Yeah. So that speaks to a recent happening. And so one of the organizations I belong to is Silicon Valley Robotics, started by a white female. She reached out and said, we need to have a race and robotics discussion. She and I had worked together for years and actually had formed a robotics themed hackerspace in Livermore when I was still at Sandia before I took my presidential appointment. So anyway, she called and talked to some other Black faculty in robotics around the country. And we got together and had this virtual panel discussion around, Black in robotics, about equity. And so we all kind of looked at one another and said, you know what, we need to organize. And so we offline after that panel discussion organized a group called Black in Robotics. And it has taken off, Kathy. So we're trying to file our 501c3 paperwork so we can accept money, because a whole bunch of companies, they want to be affiliated with Blacks in technology. And so, we're going to accept the support, but also hold them accountable in hiring and in giving our students internships. So, we're in a moment.
And what is encouraging to me is that we understand that we're in a moment.
As Obama said in, his convention speech, nowhere else on earth is, his story possible. I would say the same, despite, all the headwinds, I've faced. I've had a rewarding career, and I've done, a lot of great things that I'm proud of. Like I said, I interviewed to be an astronaut twice. I will always, have that, lust for the stars, and maybe, Elon or Jeff Bezos will have a commercial space service one day, and I might live long enough to get a ticket. But
either the ticket, or they'll need somebody to maintain the ship as it passes through the atmosphere. So you never know. You might get a free trip just because you're the repairman.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you, Maynard Holliday. To learn more about this fascinating man, visit his website at maynardholliday.com. You can also find him engaged in topical conversations on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. In addition, Maynard is a co-organizer of Blacks in Robotics, which is making companies accountable for internships, training, and hiring of African American students interested in robotics. Since this podcast in early 2021, Maynard Holliday has been appointed to the Biden-Harris administration as the Director of Research and Engineering for Modernization at the Pentagon. He has moved to Washington, D.C. and is putting together his team. We wish you all the best, Maynard. Congratulations. Thank you, Maynard Holliday, for talking with us about your incredible life. Here's hoping you will fly among the stars someday. And thank you for listening.